So you can't talk about the Reformation without talking about Martin Luther. You will hear that the Reformation was certainly more than just Luther, but to understand where we are going and why it's such a big deal, we need to understand the popularity of Martin Luther and what he did for the church. In a coming video, we'll talk about some of the other characters and ideas from the Reformation, but we're gonna start with Luther, the face of the early Reformation in the German lands. There are only a few characters in world history that are known by one name, that have seemingly been at the center of a worldwide movement. Luther is one of these few. He was born Martin Luther, the son of Hans and Margaret in the Saxon lands in 1483 in Eisleben. The family moved to nearby Mansfeld, where Hans worked in the copper mining industry. Hans was successful and oversaw a number of mines. It was his desire that his young son Martin would attend university and study the law. This would be good for him to come back into the family business to help run the mines. The Luther family was a typical late medieval Christian family, members of their local church, faithful to the Catholic Church then as they understood it. Martin would study at Mansfeld and Eisenach before heading to school at Eisleben. We will be visiting all of these major centers and see where Luther lived and developed this early thought. He graduated with a BA and an MA from Erfurt by 1505 when, according to his later recollection, everything would change. He was traveling between Erfurt and his family home in the summer of 1505 when a summer storm led to lightning and a terrified Luther prayed, "Help me, St. Anne, I will become a monk." Who was St. Anne and why was he praying to her? We're going to talk about that on this trip. Nevertheless, Luther went back to Erfurt, but instead of going back to school, he entered the monastery, one of the highlights on our trip. And after a trial period, he was allowed to join the monks. He was ordained in 1507 and celebrated his first Mass. His father was furious, and on the trip, we're going to get into the family dynamic a little bit, but Luther was an especially sensitive soul. Understanding to the extent that we can Luther's psychology is part of how we can understand his theology. Luther took the Bible very seriously. When Jesus says, "Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect," Luther is not going to take this as a do your best, but rather a call to perfection that he was sure he couldn't fulfill. Becoming a monk was his best shot at doing it right. From all accounts in the monastery, Luther took this to an extreme. When it was time to confess sins, he would spend hours upon hours trying to confess every last one. Eventually, a spiritual father to Luther had to tell him, you're being too extreme. And this is key to Luther. He'd heard about the righteousness of God, the absolute standard demanded by a holy God. He couldn't see anything beyond the absolute perfect holiness and the perfection that God demanded. And so the idea of the righteousness of God was terrifying. From that monastery at Erfurt, he was called to a new university in the eastern outpost of the empire in his native Saxony in a little town called Wittenberg. And there is a university and a monastery. And I will tell you that this town is one of my favorite in all of Europe. I lived there years ago, and this place has ranked consistently amongst the favorite places we go to on this trip. And it's there in Wittenberg that Luther became a doctor of theology, a very popular professor, but that issue of the righteousness of God, that perfection that was demanded, it stuck with him. It was later that he reflected, "My conscience was restless, and I could not depend on God being satisfied by my works. Not only," Luther says, "did I not love, but I actually hated the righteous God who punishes sinners. Thus a furious battle raged within my perplexed conscience. But meanwhile I was knocking at the door of this particular Pauline passage, earnestly seeking to know the mind of the great apostle." Luther continues, "Day and night I tried to meditate upon the significance of these words. the righteousness of God is revealed in it, as it is written, "The righteous shall live by faith." And there it was. The righteous shall live by faith, a New Testament quotation from Paul taken from Habakkuk in the Old Testament. The righteous are righteous not by their own works, but righteous by faith. Faith in God, and then faith in Christ, whose righteousness is credited to us, put into our account by faith alone. This was the breakthrough for Martin Luther. And now, any attempt to scare or cajole Christians into fear that they might not be saved, that they need anything besides faith alone, was anathema to Luther. And so the first test was when the church began a renewed push selling indulgences. We'll learn more about those on the trip, but Luther saw this as the exact opposite of the freedom he had found in the gospel. And so his 95 Theses, published in 1517, were an attack first and foremost on this practice. They were printed and published in the vernacular in German, and this made Luther an instant star. The local elector in Wittenberg, Frederick the Wise, he was a Catholic himself. In fact, he was once considered to be the next Holy Roman Emperor, but he saw this young, popular professor, even though he was making a fuss, he saw Martin Luther as the key to growing his new university. And so with his backing, Luther was protected. If you watched the earlier video that asked, why did this Reformation succeed when others failed? A big part of the answer is Frederick the Wise, his elector, protecting him. The 1520s saw an explosion of writings from Luther. He wrote commentaries and critiques of the old system. He would spend his life in Wittenberg, the face of the new movement. He would stress the freedom that the gospel brings, that by faith we are given that righteousness of God, and that there's no church hierarchy, no middleman needed. On this trip, we're going to see the places where Luther lived, where he came face to face with the powers that be, and where he launched this worldwide movement. Not a new church, but a rediscovery, a reclamation of the gospel, and a reformation of the church. I can't wait to walk the streets of Erfurt and Eisleben and Wittenberg, to see his house, to see where he studied and struggled and lived. It's a highlight of the trip and a crucial point in the history of our church and faith. But what if I told you that the story of the Reformation, as much as it is Luther, is also so much more? In our next video, I'll help take the Reformation from Luther into the rest of Europe and beyond.